So let's talk about some constitutional phrases here and clauses that are relevant as it relates to the interactions and relationships between the state and federal governments. So first is the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment is going to give power to the states. It specifically says, and it's the last amendment to the Bill of Rights, anti-federalists are very concerned that states would have power removed by the new Constitution. So the 10th Amendment says that all powers not given to the federal government or prohibited to the states are reserved to the states. So if the Constitution doesn't say anything about a power, whether they take it away from a state or grant it to the federal government, then it is a reserved power, and that's something that people use to justify widely state action and say this is something states are allowed to do because the 10th Amendment implies or says that the Constitution says nothing about it, the states can do it. So the 10th Amendment is used to justify expansion of state power. On the flip side, the 14th Amendment, which is a really important amendment added after the Civil War, restricts state power. So it specifically says in the 14th Amendment that no state will deny someone due process of law, and no state will deny someone equal protection of the law. So we'll talk about this a little bit more in our civil liberties and civil rights units, but broadly speaking, it says that states are limited in the actions they can take when it comes to infringing upon people's rights or liberties. So, the 14th Amendment is often used to expand federal power and federal protections, even if states don't agree with it. So, a good example of this would be, and we'll talk about it later on, for example, the Roe v. Wade case, which uses the 14th Amendment to say that it expands federal protections in the Constitution, even if states are trying to take away federal protections to the right to an abortion. And this is very controversial, and a lot of people disagree over whether the 14th Amendment applies in this circumstance and how to read the text of that. So we'll talk more about that later on in the course, but broadly speaking, the 10th Amendment expands states' power under the Constitution, and the 14th Amendment really limits states' powers and says there are certainly limits to what states can do. There are other constitutional clauses that really expand the power of the federal government at the expense of the states. So the Commerce Clause has been used to expand federal government power. Now, we have a lesson on this in Canvas. I would encourage you to go and take a look at this and reflect on the conversations we had around the Commerce Clause. But basically, the government has made the argument multiple times in the past that if somebody is doing something, or if a state is doing something that in any way impacts commercial activity, and that's a really broad umbrella, then the federal government has the right to regulate it or limit it. And they go so far as to say that the federal government can even limit farmers growing on their own private land food for their own consumption, because this would, if they were to buy the food from the market rather than consume it themselves, then they would have an impact on the marketplace and on interstate commerce. So the federal government has used the Commerce Clause in many instances to justify a wide expansion of federal government power. I have a number of cases on Canvas to look at that, but it's a very important clause in Article 1, Section 8 that gives the federal government power. So too is the Necessary and Proper Clause, which is at the end of Article 1, Section 8. And it says that Congress has the authority to pass any law that is, quote, necessary and proper to carry out the foregoing power. So it lists out all the powers of Congress, and then it says the Necessary and Proper Clause can be used to justify any law that is passed to allow Congress to carry out its powers. So it's been used extensively to expand congressional power. We'll talk about an example, and there's another flashcard on this on McCulloch versus Maryland, in which we talk about that case. We also have the Supremacy Clause. The Supremacy Clause is in Article 6 of the Constitution. And Article 6 of the Constitution actually simply specifies that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Now, it's not a trump card that has no exceptions. If somebody uses the Supremacy Clause as an argument for can the federal government do something, it's not, well, that's the end of the story, because there are other clauses which You can use as counterarguments, for example, the 10th Amendment. But broadly speaking, the federal government has broad authority over the states, and if the two come into conflict, then the Supremacy Clause can be used as an argument to why the federal government's argument should reign supreme. So there's a few key constitutional provisions. We'll continue this conversation in the next video.